Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of the third season of the LCLC podcast. In this episode, episode 4 of season 3, I conclude my discussion with Sam Vaknin. Sam is a professor of clinical psychology and the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, first published in 1999 and now in its 10th edition. Having explored reasons for the persistence of psychoanalytic methodologies within contemporary modes of cultural analysis, in episode 3, I shifted gears for episode 4 and asked Sam to begin our discussion by commenting directly on anti-Semitism as we find it operating globally today. I did so in part so that I may update my own theorization of this prejudice. In 2004, I published a book entitled Masculinity, Anti-Semitism, and Early Modern English Literature, which carried the subtitle From Jew Devil to Jew Sissy. In a final chapter, I argued that in the wake of 9/11, Jew hatred had entered a postmodern phase. And I called this phase postmodern anti-Semitism. And I defined anti-Semitism there in its postmodern guise as something that operated as a free-floating signifier. It could attach to many things, it could mean many things, but that in the end, it didn't have a clear, deep significance. In its postmodern phase, I wanted to suggest that anti-Semitism had lost any kind of deep logic and was no longer functioning as an apocalyptic receptacle for catalytic messianic philosophies as it had prior to 9/11, and that phase had reached its apotheosis, so to speak, with the Shoah and the Nazi effort at a final solution. With this podcast with Sam Vaknin, I want to share my theory that post-10/7 anti-Semitism has ended this earlier postmodern phase. Indeed, I no longer like to use the term anti-Semitism to describe the phenomenon. Post-10/7, I feel that we need to go back and identify the behavior and tactics that we're seeing as simply Jew hatred. I also want to add that from a normative point of view, there is no longer any substantive distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. That is why I prefer to argue that there is only Jew hatred now, and anti-Zionism is a cloak for it. With these preliminaries out of the way, I invite Sam to share with us his thoughts on the persistence of Jew hatred, particularly as it has an appeal for those elements of society that seem to take it up in ways that escape common sense. I think what Sam has to say about this phenomenon quite interesting, and I encourage you to listen with close attention. I pick it up now, giving Sam an example from a Carolyn Glick lecture. A type of behavior that people find mystifying right now in our current political worldview, which so many of the world is now focused on Israel and the war in Gaza. I gave you an example from a Carolyn Glick lecture, and you see it all over of this desire to want to understand the queers for Palestine, where this meme is often treated sort of the way that we're talking about madness, in sort of the layman's wrong way. That this just doesn't compute. I mean, these people are they're either very stupid, very crazy, stupidly crazy. They don't understand that if they were in Gaza, they would be thrown off the first building, and that's as far as the analysis on this phenomenon goes. Can you help us understand it further?
No, I don't know if I can help help you understand it further, because I suspect here I don't have any relative advantage compared to you. But I can offer my point of view.
Sure.
First of all, I believe in the footsteps of Bradley Campbell, the famous sociologist. I believe that we have transitioned from the age of dignity to the age of victimhood. The organizing principle of modern life is victimhood. Now, victimhood, like everything else in human life, has a malignant version. And unfortunately, this malignant version has taken over. It's competitive, it's defiant, it's entitled victimhood, and it's an identity. I call it reckless or psychopathic victimhood. I know it sounds like an oxymoron, psychopathic victimhood, but many recent studies, 4 of which were conducted in Israel, by the way, the Gabay studies, many recent studies show that victimhood movements are infiltrated by narcissists, with narcissists and psychopaths, especially in leadership positions. Narcissists and psychopaths leverage victimhood in order to obtain narcissistic supply, to impose obligations on others by declaring impromptu rights, and to become entitled, and to leverage and manipulate people. There's manipulative victimhood, and so on and so forth. This is established. This is in the corpus of recent psychological studies on multiple continents. We're talking British Columbia, we're talking Israel, we're talking China, we're talking... So this is pretty... Virtue signaling has become a narcissistic, psychopathic thing. Now, so this is problem number 1, that victimhood, when we try to cope with gray areas, nuances, and so on and so forth, the organizing principle that springs to mind and makes sense of the world, the hermeneutic, if you wish, or exegetic principle, is victimhood. Obviously, you're always the victim. You wouldn't want to be the abuser. But that necessitates finding abusers. Abusers are in short supply. If everyone and his dog is a victim, who is abusing? Who is victimizing? That's a problem. So we're beginning to label each other as victims. That is known as the Karpman drama triangle. In the Karpman drama triangle, victims often become abusers, and abusers often become victims. So now we have a situation that victims label each other as their abusers. So you could be in a role of a victim in one group and an abuser in the other. So the Jews, and I'm a Jew, just to remove any doubts, in case I'll be accused of anti-Semitism or something. Jews are perceived as the universal, rapacious oppressors and elites. And I'm not talking about the 20th century or the 21st century. Jews have been perceived like this in the tundras of Russia. Jews have been perceived like this in China, where there are maybe 100 Jews. Jews are cast in the role of the universal, rapacious, oppressor, and always a member of an elite. Now, the elite could be an occult elite, a hidden elite, but definitely there's an elite there. So, because Jews are the universal abusers, the universal virus, if you wish, then everyone is the victim of the Jews. Russians, Palestinians, Americans, because you can find tens of millions of Americans who would say that the Jews are victimizing America, the power of AIPAC and the Israeli lobby, and so on and so forth. Wherever you go, everyone is a victim of the Jews. And it's the same, you know, if you discuss a virus would infect a Chinese man, a Russian woman, an American girl, and a Kenyan boy equally. That's what the Jews do. Wherever they go, they oppress, they suppress, they steal. And this is, of course, I don't need to tell you, you're an expert on anti-Semitism, but this is the core of anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, as you wrote to me. Absolutely, yeah. It's simple, it's Jew hatred. But behind this, there is what Zizek would have called an ideology. And the ideology is the universalism of the Jew as a victimizer, as the Jew as an abuser. The Jews cannot help it. It's an unconscious automatic process. It's not that the Jews are malevolent necessarily, because you can find a lot of literature that doesn't say they're malevolent or malicious or premeditated. It's not intentional sometimes. It's just who they are. Toxic, poisonous. Nothing to do. Nothing can be done. It's like a snake or a virus or, a force of nature. Now, Israel is a private case because it's been established by Jews. Naturally, the foundation, the thematic ethos of Israel is abuse. Anything Jews do is intended to abuse, constructed on abuse, and the end result is abuse. So Israel is definitely an abusive entity. It is an imperialist, settler, colonial outpost. They are the aggressors. But it's only a private case, because if Israel were to vanish tomorrow, another target would have been found that is associated closely with Jews. Now, one thing to be clear, you cannot reject Zionism if you're not an anti-Semite. Why is that? Because, you know the Venn diagram? The Venn diagram, we have two circles, yep. And there's a common area.
Yep.
In the Venn diagram of Jews and Zionists, the common area is about 80%.
Right.
The vast majority of Jews are Zionists. That's a fact, inescapable fact. If you're rejecting Zionists, you're rejecting Jews. End of story. Except maybe for a 20% minority.
Right.
So Jews, because Jews are the universal virus, the universal aggressor, and I can use other metaphors and similes from Nazi literature, yeah. Because they're like that, they are never the victims. You can never be an abuser and a victim simultaneously. These are mutually exclusive propositions.
Right.
If you are the universal abuser, you could never, ever be a victim. Whatever happens to you, you had it coming. You precipitated it. In other words, whatever happens to you is just.
Let me ask you a question on this, because it's a compelling case that you're modeling here for us. Yeah, and if you can dovetail this in, and you may very well be able to, that the paradigm that you're using is shared by the basic accepted theory of anti-Semitism, namely that it's a projection of certain aspects of the anti-Semite that is found in them, like they're the capitalist, and it's projected out because they can't deal with it internally, and it finds its locus in the Jew, and it becomes this fantasy of salvation, perhaps global salvation, that we can fix everything if we just get rid of the Jews, because the Jews are now the collective exteriorized malignancy that is the problem. So we solve the problem by eliminating the Jews.
I haven't said any of this, although this is, of course, fascinating. And there is a place for this in psychology. When we deal with social psychology and so on, we, of course, in victimhood studies, for example, victimology, we, of course, recognize the power of primitive defense mechanisms, such as projection, such as splitting. And I'll come to it when I answer your last question. What I have said is because victimhood became such a dominant organizing principle, the only way to explain the world, the only way to make sense of the world, the only way to imbue your life and the world with meaning, the necessity to become a victim means that you have to find an abuser. You have to go looking for an abuser, otherwise you're not a victim. You're in trouble if you don't have an abuser. You're not a victim. And if you're not a victim, you're not entitled, your life doesn't make sense, you're not special, etc. So this new emergence of victimhood, competitive victimhood, malignant victimhood, this new emergence made people look for victims. So some people find narcissists. They say narcissists are the abuser. Psychopaths are the abuser. You know, but everyone agrees that Jews are the abusers. It's an easy pick. If you decide tomorrow, you wake up in the morning, you drink your coffee, of course, and then you say, okay, today is the day that I become a victim. And I'm going to use my victimhood to explain my life to myself, my failures, my defeats, my shortcomings, my flaws. They all have to do with the fact that I've been victimized as a child, I've been victimized as an adult, I've been victimized in the workplace. Victimhood suits me perfectly. It makes sense of my life, it calms me down, it's anxiolytic, reduces anxiety. It's wonderful. There's only one problem. No one has ever victimized me. I can't find an abuser. It's horrible. Oh, wait a minute. There's the Jews. The Jews victimize me, directly, indirectly. So the Jews are the default option if you fail to find another identifiable abuser. They're always there. They're like background noise. They are a perfect universal agent of abuse. And so that's what I'm saying. In an age of victimhood, the Jews are likely to be selected as abusers and victimizers time and again, regardless of reality. It's counterfactual. It's mythological even, but that's the way it is. And it combines with three other very pernicious psychological processes. As if this were not enough, and it is enough, it goes hand in hand with three other processes. One is known as the Stockholm Syndrome. The Stockholm Syndrome is a fantasy defense. Reality is too unbearable, too intolerable. For example, your life is threatened. You can't countenance this. You can't digest it. So, and the Stockholm Syndrome has to do with helplessness, dependency, and so on and so forth. And it leads to the idealization of the aggressor. I'm not going to the history of Stockholm Syndrome. There's also a huge debate whether it's real or not. Huge debate. But I think it's a useful metaphor in the worst case, and maybe it does exist in the best case. But it explains a lot. It explains why we identify with aggressors, why we identify with violent people, why we identify with terrorists, why we identify with criminals. Because it feels safer. If you're on the side of the terrorist and you're helpless and you're dependent and you're afraid for your life and you don't want to go to war and so on and so forth, it would feel good to be on the side of the terrorist. It's an emanation from weakness. There's an underlying assumption of weakness. This was the reason for the appeasement policy in the 1930s with Adolf Hitler. You know, the democracies didn't feel that they were strong enough to cope with him. So they adopted his point of view. They became his hostages in a Stockholm Syndrome type. I think these kids, these scholars, so-called scholars, these academics, anyone who supports Hamas is because they're afraid of Hamas. And they're loath. They don't want to admit that they're afraid. They don't want to acknowledge their helplessness, their dependency, their terror, their weakness, their vulnerability, their fragility. They don't want to acknowledge any of these things. So they idolize and idealize Hamas. It's better to be on Hamas's side because Hamas is winning the war, not the physical war. Not the physical war, the war for hearts and minds. Because Hamas, if you disagree with Hamas, they throw you off a building. They have no inhibitions, no morals, no rules. There's no game except their game. If you don't identify with Hamas, you will be heckled in the best case. You may be beaten to death, as happened in Gaza only yesterday, to a dissident. In the worst case, people automatically identify with dictators, with tyrants, with terrorists, with criminals, with violent people, because it's safer to be on their side. It feels safer. And this is known as the Stockholm Syndrome. And then there's trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is a power imbalance that involves fear, terror, dominance, intermittent reinforcement, hot and cold behavior, and leads to self-harm. Organizations like Hamas, dictators like Putin, they are traumatizing the West. There is a process of trauma, unacknowledged trauma. It's terrifying to know that terrorists can travel all the way to your country, destroy half of Manhattan, and kill 3,000 people, if they so desire, and if you're not the friend of these terrorists. So better to be the friend of the terrorists, and better to bond with these terrorists, and better to idealize them, and better to create for them a literature and ideology that kind of elevates them and on the high moral ground. It's a fear reaction, it's atavistic, it's primordial, and it involves trauma bonding and the Stockholm Syndrome. And finally, when you do that, when you choose the disinhibited, violent, dangerous side, because you're afraid to be on the other side, you're afraid to suffer the consequences of confronting Hamas. You're afraid to suffer the consequences, so you'd rather be with Hamas. This is self-gaslighting. You are falsifying reality. You're lying to yourself. It's counterfactual. And so this is self-gaslighting. Your reality testing, your ability to tell reality from fantasy gets impaired. There's damage to your ability to discern reality exactly as it is. And so these are the processes that collude to push people, especially fragile, vulnerable, broken, damaged, fearful, weak people, push them to take the side of the likes of Putin or Hamas. Or because, you know, who would you want to have as your friend in case of a brawl or a fight? Would you like to have Biden or would you like to have Putin? Putin, probably.
Right.
And you can criticize Israel to your heart's content. You can act against Israel. You can burn the Israeli flag. You can spit on Israel, the Israeli embassy. You can shoot a bow and arrow at the Israeli guard. You can do anything, and Israel will not do anything to you. Israel is not in the habit of killing dissidents or protesters, or Israel will not do anything to you. It's a civilized country with rules and laws, and you know, it plays by the rules, plays the game. But if you dare to confront China, if you dare to confront Putin, if you dare to confront Hamas volubly enough, you're taking a risk, definitely. Mm-hmm. It is riskless to attack Israel and risky to attack Hamas.
Do you think that these mechanisms that you've brought to the fore to explain the behavior that we're shorthanding as the Queers for Palestine meme, do you think that this is something that has been enabled to work maybe in a kind of supercharged way by the technology of the day, by the fact that, as I heard you say in another interview that you did recently, that the majority of young people today are spending their time playing video games?
Well, technology has always been there. I mean, the printing press allowed people to print pamphlets and to distribute pamphlets as never before. Technology has always been at the service of the zeitgeist and social mores and norms and behaviors. So I don't blame technology at all. I think technology reflects. I think technology is never a leader. It's a follower.
Gotcha.
When narcissism started to rise in the 1980s, the emergence of social media was only a question of time. But narcissism started to rise in studies by Twenge, Campbell, others. Narcissism started to rise dramatically, exponentially in the 1980s, early 1980s, long before social media.
I've wanted to call the Gaza conflict the Fortnite war in the way in which people talked about Vietnam as the television war. It was the time when Americans had war come into their dinner time with Walter Cronkite. And now it's like if I have a son who loves Fortnite, and when you watch somebody play these first person shooter games, you get really specific. I mean, you can you can shoot just that one person, and you don't shoot that person. And when you shoot that person that you shouldn't shoot, then you get a deduction. And and it's all done exactly right, and that there is this sort of expectation that the IDF should be able to pursue a war in a fortnight manner, that is, without any taking out anyone but the bad guys, because you can do it in a video game.
Well, I don't see the same criteria applied to Russia. When was the last time you've seen massive anti-Russia demonstrations with Ukraine flags draping nimble figures of the young? I don't see this being applied to Myanmar or Sudan or Russia or any of the, hold your breath, 78 conflicts raging across the globe as we speak. All of them involving civilian casualties. Some of them involving civilian casualties on a scale that dwarfs Gaza. So I don't see, I don't think that's the issue. If I may, I think there's another problem here.
Please.
Whenever Jews are perceived as empowered, there is a huge well of resentment and hatred and rejection and aggression. Jews are not supposed to be empowered. The protocols of the elders of Zion were published in the 19th century. It was a falsification by the Okhrana, by the Russian Secret Service. So, but it wasn't titled The Protocols of the Elders of the Hebrew People. It wasn't titled The Protocols of the Elders of the Jews. It was titled The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Zion is a political entity. And it was a prototypical world government. What was described in this pamphlet, later made into a book, was a prototypical world government. So it was about political power, geopolitical power. It was about power. The hatred in the protocols, the resentment, the vile accusations, they all centered around the fact that Jews have power and are exercising it in their secret meetings in cemeteries and so on. But they're exercising power. That's inconceivable, unacceptable. Consider, for example, the riots at the beginning of the 19th century in Bavaria. The slogan during these riots in 1819 and 1820, the slogan was "Hep hep."
Right.
Hep hep. Now, later, it was suggested that hep was hierosolyma est perdita. We both know probably that it's apocryphal. It's not true. But it doesn't matter. The very idea that hep could mean this is enough. What is hierosolyma est perdita? It's a Latin verse that talks about the demise of the power of the Jews in the polity of Judea, in the polity of Israel at the time, with the Roman conquest. So hep hep, as it was interpreted later, was directed at the fact of a political power, the fact that Jews had a political power, and they were celebrating and reveling at the collapse and disintegration of Jewish political power. That was the beginning of the 19th century. That's 200 years ago. Similarly, the conspiracy theory about the Rothschild family. It was not about money. Rothschild made a fortune. It was not about money. It was about the power that the Rothschild willed over, for example, monarchies. It was all about power. All these conspiracy theories, and the mother of all conspiracy theories was the blood libel. And conspiracy theories started with Jews. But all these conspiracy theories were about the fact that the Jews should never have power. Power should be proscribed, not prescribed, but proscribed. And when and if Jews have power, they abuse it. When and if Jews have power, it should be taken away from them. Jews should be disempowered, should be weak, should be dependent, should be at the mercy of decision-making by others, should be exterminated, of course, from time to time, to varying degrees. So there is a resentment of the empowerment of the Jews, and the state of Israel is only the latest latest reincarnation of this resentment against Jewish power.
Right.
And there's another thing, Moses Hess, one of the first kind of Zionist thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
He suggested that Jews are the equivalent of ghosts. They're a nation without a homeland, and so they're like ghosts. And he said that the Gentiles are reacting to Jews because they're like ghosts, and there's this visceral reaction to ghosts. The same reaction you have with cockroaches. You recoil. It's a visceral reaction. Jews do represent what we call in psychology a prolonged grief disorder. Jewish grief is built into, hardwired, baked into basic foundational Jewish texts. For example, the Haggadah, the Pesach Haggadah. It's full of grief, full of mourning. And it's a prolonged grief disorder because it's been lasting more than 2,000 years. So we do have some pathologies associated with the mode of existence of the Jews and the decisions which were forced upon them, for example, which kind of professions they could occupy. There have been some pathologies associated with the Jewish existence. Some of these pathologies brought on by the Jews. Some of these pathologies imposed on them. The Jewish rejection of others, the Jewish insistence on living apart, kosher laws, and so on and so forth, this was perceived as rejection by the Gentiles, so it created bad blood. On the other hand, when the Jews tried to get emancipated in the 19th century, it generated another syndrome described by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud called it the narcissism of small differences. When there is a group, a minority, who try to emulate the majority, this creates in the majority resentment and hatred. And so it's a no-win situation. When the Jews kept themselves apart, sequestered in ghettos and I don't know where, they were hated because they kept themselves apart, because it implied that they were the chosen people, because the Gentiles perceived it as rejection and contempt. But when the Jews tried to mingle with the Gentiles and become like Gentiles, Germans with the Moses Creed, again the Gentiles rejected the Jews and hated them exactly because they were trying to emulate the Gentiles. There was a no-win situation here, no-win strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the no-win strategy had to do with the fact that the Jews refused to disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And the very fact that they insisted on existence was perceived as a form of defiance. I mean, you exist, therefore you are defiant. You should not exist. Why do you exist? You should not exist on religious grounds because you killed Jesus. You're the one who killed Jesus. You should not exist on political grounds. You should not exist. And your existence is defiance. And defiance means that you have some power. Defiance, automatically, the association is power. So empowered Jews should not roam the land. They should be exterminated. And when they are concentrated in their own country, called the State of Israel, and they are super empowered there, because they have an army and an air force, that triggers and provokes the Gentiles into convulsive, apoplectic reactions. But these reactions are 2,000 years old. And they're triggered, they're handed down the generations, they're part of the collective unconscious, if you wish.
As we round perhaps the last, I'm talking to you from Louisville, Kentucky, so as we round the last turn here, coming down the home stretch, let me ask you another question, which is, given everything that you've said about how you see Queers for Palestine being read today, and how we've looped it into your understanding of anti-Semitism and how it's playing out right now in our current political situation, my own thinking about it is that I introduced the concept of postmodern anti-Semitism, where I talked about it as being cut off from these sort of earlier mechanisms of, if we just kill the Jews, we'll realize the society, the Reich that we need. It has to come at their expense. We have to weed the garden. And if we weed the garden, we'll get the great garden that we want, and that we no longer believe that. But that although that dream died, anti-Semitism lived on as what I called a free-floating signifier. Whether you agree with that or not, I have been thinking that, in my own thought, that phase has come to an end, and that it's fair to think about anti-Semitism in a new phase, a post-10/7 phase of a kind of radicalized desire to proceed with these sort of fantasies of extinction, perhaps again to realize some sort of better tomorrow. What is your own thought about how you read where we are right now in relation to these concepts?
My conceptual framework is victimhood. So I think I've elaborated on this. I wouldn't like to do it a second time. As to what you have said, this goes much deeper, because fantasies of purification underlie, for example, psychology. When you go to psychotherapy, it's a process of purification. When Freud discussed the reactivation of hidden, repressed material in the unconscious, together with the affect, with the emotions attendant upon these memories, a process known as abreaction, he was talking about purification. So purification is a very potent, very powerful, all-pervasive, ubiquitous symbol, not only in the study of alterity or otherness, not only in the study of hatred, and not only in the study of anti-Semitism as a private case of, but I think it underlies theology and psychology and many, many, many other things. Again, the Jews are a perfect symbol, because there's 2,000 years of indoctrination that the Jews are some kind of an impurity. They are the repository. One could even say that the Jews are the unconscious. They are the unconscious, because they are the repository of everything that's hidden, everything that's forbidden, everything that's repressed, everything that's forgotten. They're very old. They are preternaturally old. And they're ghost-like, as I said, and so this process of purification by getting rid of the Jews is an irresistible proposition, because it's simple. It's a simple recipe. It's one act. You don't have to think too hard. It appeals to our age, the age of the meme, the age of the soundbite, the age of limited attention span. You don't need to go deep. You don't need to study, to analyze, to educate yourself. You don't need any of this. If you want to feel pure, if you want to reduce your anxiety, if you want to explain your victimhood and so on, there's a single address, and that's the Jew. I think the Jew is the sacrificial lamb. In Judaism, we had the cow, the heifer cow, and so on. So there's this animal, could be a lamb, could be a cow, depending on the... There's this animal that becomes the repository of our bad deeds, the repository of our sins, the repository of our shortcomings and flaws and doubts, and then we kill this animal. We drive it off a cliff. And humanity has been trying to drive the Jews off a cliff and thereby cleanse itself. This is really ethnic cleansing, but reverse ethnic cleansing. Humanity was trying to cleanse itself by driving this symbolic animal off the cliff, and the animal refuses. The animal refuses to be driven off the cliff. It possesses power, resilience, strength, self-conviction, and so on and so forth. And this is infuriating because you are one step away from being pure and being cleansed and being elevated and being enlightened and being perfect and being, one step away. All it takes is for the Jews to cease to exist. Is that such a big thing to ask? And yet the Jews refuse, and their refusal and their defiance, backed by ever-increasing power, at least in the imagination of the Gentiles. This is utterly discombobulating. It's utterly infuriating, and it drives people, as I said, to convulsive apoplectics, to utterly crazy behavior. Like this woman that you sent me, her opinion piece.
Yeah.
I mean, she writes, Hamas.
Jody Dean.
What was her name?
Jody Dean.
Yes, I had the misfortune of spending 10 minutes on her piece. So she writes, for example, Hamas was democratically elected. Well, the same way Hitler was democratically elected. She prostitutes her intellect in order to gain popularity. Or, the alternative, she is an unmitigated idiot. In both cases, she has my contempt. But I understand their behavior. The Jewish question, it's very evocative, this phrase, the Jewish question, as if the Jews are a question mark. Mm-hmm. The Jews are a constant question mark, and the Gentiles fail to find the answer. It's very humiliating, demeaning, degrading that you fail to find the answer. And the Judenfrage, the Jewish question, is such that it triggers behaviors which are regressive, infantile, primitive defenses, impaired reality testing, these aspects of infantile regression that are usually reserved to when you react to a threat. When you react to threat, uncertainty, extreme insecurity, you regress, you become an infant again. And it involves defenses such as splitting. The Jew is all bad, we are all good. This is known as splitting defense in psychology. When you say one group is all bad, I'm all good. So this is splitting, projection. Your hate, your guilt, your shame, you dump them on the Jews. They are the perfect trauma dumpster. There's a process known as trauma dumping. And then you rationalize everything you're saying. But in the process, you come out, you're verging on insanity. This sentence, Hamas was democratically elected, is not only counterfactual, it's grounds for committing her to a mental asylum. Because only someone with a severe impairment in reality testing could write this sentence. So what to tell you? These people are driven crazy by the existence of the Jews. The Jews are a trigger. We call it in trauma studies, trigger. The Jews trigger people. They trigger their trauma defenses, their guilt, their shame, their hatred. Their behaviors become chaotic, disorganized, dysregulated emotions. Jews drive people to become borderline. There's a massive borderline personality disorder. By the way, we have a name for it in the DSM. It's called mass psychogenic illness. anti-Semitism is a mass psychogenic illness.
I wanted to ask you, I had two more questions here. Let's see if we can knock them off. One was for your, for you to talk a little bit more about your characterization of the war in Gaza, where you talked a little bit about Sinwar and expanded upon the psychology you see there and the psychology that you see in the field by Netanyahu, but also sort of generally in how the Israelis are pursuing this war. And the terms that you introduced was that this was a sort of struggle between a narcissistic mindset uh, in the Israelis and a psychopathic mindset in Hamas. And my joke about that was, but you forgot to say that they're married and they don't see any way out of the relationship. So they're stuck. Is this still a characterization that you find useful?
Yes. Well, if it's a marriage, it's a Catholic marriage between a Muslim and a Jew, because they can't divorce. There's no way to divorce or to break up. You know, in most marriages nowadays, you can simply divorce if there's irreconcilable differences. Yes, I still think it's instructive. Of course, it's metaphorical, and no one can diagnose, not safely. You can diagnose, but not safely. The collective is narcissistic or psychopathic because there are always outliers and exceptions, and individual exceptions and so on. But the general conduct of Israel and the IDF, which is very common in post-traumatic situations. Israel has been traumatized time and again, at least 7 times that I can recall, and sometimes severe trauma, such as in 1973 and on October 7th. These are severe traumas. It's very common among people with what we call CPTSD, complex trauma, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Very common for such people to behave in a narcissistic way. Narcissism is a defense mechanism that is triggered by complex trauma. So it's unsurprising that Israel is becoming more and more and more narcissistic. It's a reaction to complex trauma. On the other hand, the Palestinians, I made a distinction between Palestinians and Hamas. Hamas, more precisely, is an utterly psychopathic organization. I mean, all the criteria for psychopathy as defined by Robert Hare apply and more. It's an utterly psychopathic organization. The Palestinians are distinct from Hamas, but they largely support Hamas. Hamas is well over 50% in Gaza and well over 70% in the West Bank in terms of support. So Hamas is becoming equated with the Palestinians more and more. The Palestinians celebrate October 7th. The vast majority of them, 93% to be precise, think that it was a good thing that has happened for a variety of reasons, post facto, but that's the situation. So yeah, I think we're dealing with a battle like Godzilla against AVP or whatever. So I think we're dealing with a battle between narcissists and psychopaths. As to the solution, because you've asked me about the solution, and again, I'm not assuming here some divine power of, power of divination or some outstanding intellect is going to solve the Israeli. But as I see it, the only solution is protracted sempiternal conflict or ethnic cleansing and genocide. There is no third solution. And the reason there is no third solution is because both groups of people, both collectives, nations or not nations, doesn't matter, both collectives have maintained and have maintained always maximalist positions, with a few exceptional years in Israel's history. But both of them have maintained maximalist positions when it comes to a very well-defined territory. And I don't see this resolved. The two-state solution is a chimera that cannot survive. The Palestinians insist overwhelmingly on the right of return, which is a re-annexation or recapturing of the allegedly lost lands in Israel. The Israelis now, in the past 25 years, the Israelis have held a maximalist position, annexing the Golan Heights, settlements in the West Bank, and now openly talking about resettling Gaza.
Yeah, the greater Israel position.
I don't know. I can't see a middle ground. Never mind what a wizard you are, Henry Kissinger to the power of 10. You could still, I don't think you could come up with a solution to this. And then the only things left are ethnic cleansing, also known as transfer, a solution that has been proposed numerous times, by the way, in the country. Or unfortunately, genocide, which I think no one will contemplate. I'm sure not even the Palestinians. So it's a very sad situation. And of course, the only other solution, or maybe the only solution actually, is a one-state solution. But that would sacrifice the Jewish nature of the state. Israel, as we all know, has to choose between being Jewish and being democratic. And if it chooses democracy, it will no longer be Jewish. And then there will be a one state, perhaps a confederacy, like Canada or even Switzerland, a confederacy of two entities. Yugoslavia survived for many years with 6 or 5 actually republics and one autonomous or 2 autonomous areas. The United States is essentially a confederacy, increasingly more a confederacy than a federal entity. So we have precedents of confederacies that are working. Switzerland is not a bad example. Confederacies, even Lebanon, believe it or not, Lebanon is an example of a confederacy that is working very well. There was a civil war in Lebanon, which lasted more than 15 years. And then the parties sat down and established a confederacy. And it's working well. Lebanon has been at peace until now. So maybe a confederacy. But as long as the two parties insist total ownership of the land to the exclusion of the other, I see no solution. The two-state solution is an example of fantasy overtaking reality. Mm-hmm. Or optimism overtaking experience.
Right. So we touched on the last question that I had, but I'll come back to it before inviting you to comment in a final way about any stray thoughts or points you wish to make. And that was getting back to the Jody Dean piece and the way in which you make sense of the resurgence is the word I want here. The resurgence of this kind of binary thinking, all bad, all good, at the same time that we see this apparent rejection of binary thinking. A good example of it is in current American sort of obsessions with gender fluidity, for example, where we're teaching our children, the last thing you want to do is think in a hard binary of male, female. But when it comes to making sense of this political situation, all good, all bad, how have we ended up here?
Well, I think the splitting defense. The clinical term for this is splitting defense. I think the splitting defense characterizes all political discourse, definitely in the United States. I mean, you ask any Republican, they will tell you the Democrats are all bad. There's no redeeming feature. And vice versa, if I may add. Mm-hmm. So I think splitting is taking over as the dominant mode of political discourse, and not only in the United States. For example, look at the French elections, recent election, where the far right has been utterly demonized. Mm-hmm. Utterly demonized. Not that I'm a far right supporter, absolutely not, but they were demonized.
Right.
Splitting involves a sense of virtue, self-aggrandizement, because you are perfect, you are pure, you're clean, you're right. When you split, you're always in the right. And that's very anxiety reducing. Splitting emerges in political discourse in times of high anxiety, in times of uncertainty. So you had splitting in the 1930s, but you didn't have splitting in, let's say, the 1950s. Mm-hmm. So when there's times of high anxiety and uncertainty, people split. And politics is made up of human beings, most of them, politicians excluded, but made up of human beings. And this is the natural reaction of human beings. They regress, they become infantile, and they activate defense mechanisms, such as projection also. In projection, you attribute to the other the parts in yourself that you reject, the parts in yourself that you're uncomfortable with, that you're ashamed of. Your weakness, for example, or your avarice, or your propensity to hate, or you attribute it to the other because you can't cope with the fact of who you are, with your identity. So we are witnessing a deterioration, a devolution in political discourse across the board and in all countries, no exception, because reality has become intolerable, unbearable, and seriously, seriously frightening and threatening. So we are all whistling in the dark. We're all babes in the wood. Mm-hmm. And the intellectuals, especially public intellectuals, which should have served as the bulwark, it should have served as a firewall against primitive defense. They were swept by the tide. When I read this woman's opinion piece, that is splitting. She sees no nuances. There are no gray zones. There's one party that is 100% right and one party that is 100% evil.
Right.
But she has betrayed her calling. Our role as intellectuals is exactly this: to counter primitive defenses such as splitting and projection, to enlighten and to point the way and to expose if necessary and to fight back and to take risks as intellectuals to do that, to introduce nuance and gray zone and subtleties and a form of thinking that takes into account everything and doesn't become counterfactual by excluding some information. This is the role of intellectuals, and I regret to say that I don't know of a single major and even minor public intellectual who is doing this. They're all polarized, taking sides, splitting and projecting themselves, and educating future generations along these lines, poisoning them. It's toxic. And I'm not limiting myself to progressive liberals or conservatives. The fault is on both sides. Conservatives like Jung. Progressive liberals, they like Lacan. But what they're doing with Jung and with Lacan has nothing to do with Jung or Lacan. Mm-hmm. It's an abuse. It's abusive.
Let me ask you one last question, and then I'll invite you to make any kind of closing remarks you wish to make. In our discussion, it occurs to me that one term that we haven't taken out of the toolbox, and its absence in the conversation is why I'm bringing it up now to get your thoughts on it, is perversion. And of course, we're at the end of the interview, and this is where perversion always comes up. It comes up at the stage.
We can't hold it anymore.
Not done yet.
We can't hold it anymore.
Yeah, it's not just neurosis and psychosis. There's perversion, and then it's too late. But to what extent does concepts of perversion afford some utility for you as a thinker in your work?
No, I'm adamantly opposed to this concept.
Okay, why?
Because it's culture bound. It's been contaminated throughout the ages, last 150 years, last 100 years. It's been contaminated repeatedly, time and again, by culture, society, politics, mores, preferences, agendas, and so on and so forth, to the point that it's can no longer be extricated, or is no longer extricable, no longer can be separated from these overt layers of contamination. You know, when Freud came up with the concept of free association, that's one of a few things that he really came up with. By the way, talk therapy was not Freud, of course, it was Breuer. So when he came up with the idea of free associations, he came up with a brilliant concept in my view, because he exposed to us the fact that even single words carry numerous archaeological layers of meaning, semantic meanings, and possibly, if it's written, semiotic meanings, but meanings. There's no word that is neutral, objective, a word that is lexical, dictionary definition. I mean, that's not true. These are fantasies. When you say perversion, immediately it triggers in my mind layers upon layers upon layers upon layers, which I regard as contaminants and pollutants. Don't help me. So I prefer not to use. This is a highly triggering word, which I prefer to not use.
Gotcha. Well, I invite you now at this point, before I thank you for the wonderful conversation, to introduce any thoughts that you would just beat yourself up if you didn't get the chance to say it now.
I beat myself up in any case. I'm Jewish. I'm Jewish. That's what we do. Self-flagellate. We can't help it. This is the perversion. I think we are at a crossroads, two types of crossroads. First, in our understanding of the mind, and whether the mind exists at all, or whether it's some form of obstruction or a desperate attempt to put together disparate elements. There is a huge debate about consciousness and mind and the connection to the brain. Issues of dualism are emerging again, and so on and so forth. And I think we are on the precipice of a revolution in language. I think the only way forward is if we have a linguistic breakthrough. I did something similar in physics, by the way. Together with a group of physicists. I'm a physicist by training, what to mention. Together with a group of physicists all over the world, we made use of my Ph.D. dissertation in physics, dating back to 1983, but we revived it. We took it out of the mothballs. And the idea in my PhD dissertation was to try to rewrite physics, to derive all of physics, but using a single word, time. Now, in physics, we have many words. We have motion, we have momentum, we have force, we have object. There are many, many words. Mass. We have many words. I said, let's try a language that has a single word, only time. And let's see if we use this language and we limit ourselves to the use of the word time. Can we then derive the totality of physics? And by today, I can say the answer is yes. So I'm giving this as an example. I think we should do something similar in psychology. There has been a proliferation of terms and concepts. Occam's razor has been broken to pieces. There's no parsimony. And there are many, many words and terms and phrases that are ill-defined. The terminology is not only non-consensual, there's no consensus on terminology, but sometimes they don't bother to define even. They just invent a word and they're gone, as if the word is... So I think we are headed towards a linguistic revolution in psychology. The second point, the last, I promise, is the interface between the individual and collectives. I'm not saying society and purpose, because society is a new idea. If you went back to the Middle Ages, there was no concept of society. It's a very new idea. So I'm not saying society. I'm saying collective. The interface between individual and collective. Is the collective a mere assemblage of individuals? Can it be reduced to the individuals? Is it an epiphenomenon? Is it an emergent phenomenon? Are the same principles that we apply to individuals, are they transferable or transmissible to collectives without any change? By the way, we have a similar problem in physics. Where we have laws that describe elementary particles, but when we try to apply them to macroscopic bodies, they break down. So there's a lot of affinity between psychology and physics on some levels. So individual, collective. We are trying to understand collective dynamics by applying theories in physics which have dealt exclusively with the individual. It's time to stop this practice because it's very likely to be wrong. I don't have proof that it's wrong, but I think it's wrong. It's time to come up with theories, psychological theories, not sociological theories, and not psychological theories that deal with collectives and ignore the individual. Not collectives as assemblage of individuals, but collectives as separate entities, and ignore the individual, treating collectives as epiphenomena, as emergent phenomena. The same way when I describe the physics of your water glass, I wouldn't specify what the atoms in your water glass are doing. The atoms comprising your glass of water are irrelevant when I try to describe the behavior of your glass. So we need a new psychology, but not an extrapolation of individual psychology and not an amalgamation of individual psychology. There's something that has nothing to do with individual psychology. And no one has done this yet. Once this is done, I think we're going to decipher and decode many, many things that hitherto befuddle us, and they're enigmatic. For example, the amazing phenomenon of anti-Semitism, which I think all psychological theories fail miserably at explaining.
Well, I appreciate the chance to talk to you, Sam, and I appreciate the being an audience for you to share some of your thoughts, especially the ones that you talked about here at the end, which are big ideas.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. My thanks again to Sam Vaknin for agreeing to participate in this podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode or any of the others, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a review, and even perhaps telling a friend or two. Most especially, we'd love for you to join us at an upcoming LCLC conference. To learn more, reach out to me directly, Matthew Biberman, or you can find details at thelouisvilleconference.com. Thanks again for listening.